Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrel Eskelson. My guest today is Tony Wheeler. In the 1970s, Tony and his wife Maureen bought a car and drove it along the hippie trail from London to Afghanistan. From there, they continued on to Australia, where they wrote a book about the experience called Across Asia on the Cheap. This became the first in a series of best-selling guidebooks called Lonely Planet. Tony joins me today to talk about his life of travel and the changes that he's seen in the world. Tony, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good to be here.
So I learned that you lived for the first few years of your life in Karachi. Would you mind sharing, what did your father do in Pakistan? And do you have any memories from that experience?
Yeah, my father was, this is going back a long time, of course. He was an RAF pilot, a pilot trainer during World War II. After the war, there were an awful lot of excess pilots around, so he didn't end up being an airline pilot, but he did join BOAC, British Overseas Airways Corporation, later to be British Airways as it is today. And at that time, the airlines, today everything is outsourced and they don't need, they do need to do a lot of things, but they don't do it themselves. But in those days, they would send out staff to the offices around the airports, the stations around the world. And my father was sent to help run the airport at Karachi in Pakistan. And I, at the age of 1.5, followed him, and I lived there till I was 5 or 6. So the first few years of my life. And it's remarkable how, anything I can remember from Pakistan, I know what age I was. There's no question. I was a young child. And yet I've got a lot of really, really clear memories. It's remarkable how clear they are. And I've been back to Pakistan quite a few times. When was the most recent time? Probably 5-6 years ago. But, I've been back numerous times. And on one occasion, and this is going back quite a few years, 30 years ago, but that was still 40 years after I lived there. I went back to Karachi, and I had the address of the house we had an apartment in, and I walked by it, and it looked exactly as I remembered it from the age of 5. I would have, remembered it instantly. It was exactly as I remembered it. I remember quite a few incidents around that place, and I've got lots of other memories of Pakistan, but one of the funniest was, I can remember when I was, this small 5-year-old child, my father used to take me down to the Karachi harbour, and we would contract with a small fishing boat, and they would take us out on the harbour, and we'd fish for crabs just by putting a bit of bait on a bit of string and lowering it into the water, and up comes the crab. So anyway, all these many years later, I walked back down to the Karachi harbour, and damn me, within 5 minutes, I'm on a fishing boat, and I'm out on the harbour, and I'm fishing for crabs. And I'm thinking, God, I remember this when I'm 5, and now I'm 45 or something. Remarkable.
Yeah, it's remarkable that things stayed the same enough that you could recognize them. It's interesting. So you spent time in other places while you were growing up, in the Bahamas and the United States. I'd like to ask you, growing up, what was your sense of being English, considering you didn't spend a lot of time in England?
No, I didn't really return. I returned for a year between Pakistan and the Bahamas because I was just starting primary school, and my parents sent me off to live with my grandparents, but that was just a year or so. And then they picked me up, and my father was transferred. I guess Karachi was looked upon as a hardship station, and he was sent to Nassau in the Bahamas, which definitely was not hardship. So I then spent a couple of years in the Bahamas and had a very good time there, I remember, as well. And then went back to England again for just a year or so. And then my father was sent off to the States, and he worked at 2 airports in the States. First of all, Detroit. And of course, you say to anybody these days, Detroit, oh, Detroit. And, back in the era I was there, it was the era of cars with big tail fins and lots of chrome and so on. The Motor City. Now this would have been before Tamla Motown and before punk rock and all the other things that Detroit later would take under its wing. But, making cars in those days, Detroit was per capita the wealthiest city in America. And, it just seemed fine to me. It was. So I spent a few years in Detroit. And then my father was shifted again, and he was shifted to Baltimore at a time when, before they built Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C., so Friendship Airport in Baltimore was the international airport for Baltimore and for D.C. because the Washington National Ronald Reagan wasn't around yet as a president. So yeah, I spent a couple of years and had a great time in Baltimore as well. And Detroit went wrong after I left, and the same for Baltimore. But that was great. And then family shifted back to England, and I finished school in England, went to university in England, and then started off on my adventures.
I learned that you wrote for the school newspaper when you were a student there. I'm interested to ask if later, when you and your wife were working out how to write the book that you had envisioned, if any lessons or experience from your school newspaper days might have helped you guys out.
Well, not school, university newspaper.
Yes, university.
Yeah. There were sort of school publications. I remember putting together a history of World War One paper in school. It must have been in Detroit. I divided a really good school teacher. I remember that. We divided the class up into groups, and we all had to produce our own sort of history of the war newspaper. No, but I went to we called them new universities. In the 60s in Britain, they established a number of new universities because there were all these baby boomers like me appearing and needing more places at university. And I went to a brand new university. I was the first year there. So we had to set up a university newspaper, and I was involved in setting that up. So, I learned a little bit about writing and publishing and laying things out and putting things together, which later proved very useful at Lonely Planet.
Mm-hmm. When you were on the trip in 1972, you and your wife Maureen bought a car in London and drove it along the hippie trail to Afghanistan. Did you take any notes or have a diary, a journal of any kind, or document with photos?
Yeah. Because we didn't call, I don't think we called it the hippie trail at that time. It was the Asia Overland Route or the Overland Route, and the hippie trail title got tagged onto it. And a good title. It's a great thing to say, oh yeah, I was on the hippie trail. That got tagged on later on. And I mean, what prompted the start of Lonely Planet was the fact that there was this serious information deficit. There wasn't a lot of information. There was. I remember in London there was one thing you could use, which was called the Bit Guide. Bit from computer information, bit, and you could go to a door in Notting Hill in London. Notting Hill, of course, now is a very salubrious area. We've all seen what was the movie Notting Hill that everybody loved, Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts. Yeah. But it wasn't that way in those days. It was a much more rough and ready area. And you knocked on the appropriate door and someone came and you paid them a quid. And they gave you a bit guide, which was mimeograph pages of travel information that people had sent back, sort of early social media. And that was about the only information we had on the trip we were setting out on. But, travel, you meet other people coming the other way, and that's the main source. And I've always been a bit of a note taker, and I wish I'd been more of a note taker back then, but I took enough notes that with assorted help, we managed to make it into a book when we got to Australia.
So after you guys published that book and the next one about Southeast Asia, how long into the development of Lonely Planet before you and Maureen started hiring additional staff to work with you? When did it actually start to grow as a company?
We did the first book across Asia, which we did in Sydney, and we both had full-time jobs because we were saving up money. We lived on one salary and saved the other, and saving up money to travel some more. So that first book was done, as a sideline. After the 9 to 5 life, then we worked on that Lonely Planet Guide, and then we traveled for a year. The year around Southeast Asia, which was 1974, was researching Southeast Asia on a shoestring, and then we published that guide in 75. So at this point, we had 2 guides. We had the Across Asia guide, and we had the Southeast Asia guide. But then pretty quickly, we started finding other writers. We found 2 in 76, essentially. A Nepalese guy, Prakash Raj, who had living in Kathmandu, and he'd written his own little guidebook for visitors to Kathmandu, which was called Nepal on $1 a day in the first edition. But inflation being what it is, the second edition became Nepal on $2 a day. And we contacted Prakash and said, great book. Wouldn't it be a lot better if I published it for you? And, you sold lots more copies, which he agreed to. And we went to Nepal and met up with Prakash and started a relationship that went on for quite a few years. And so our third book was his Nepal guide. And then we met an American living in Nepal who was a trekking guide. And so our fourth book was his trekking guide. But then this is 76 now. We left London in 72. So 4 years later, 76, we got back to London. And the first thing I did there was I went round to the Bit people where I'd paid £1 for my Bit Asia Overland Guide. And at this time, Bit, which was very much a creature of the 60s and an information source, and they made money from their Bit guides, but they spent money on helping out people with drug busts and needing a place to live and everything else under the hippie London 60s sun. And that was sort of dying out. And Jeff Crowther was the guy who put together the Bit guides. And we said to Jeff, great job. And you've been doing this for years for nothing. Why don't you take what was the Bit? Because Jeff was a real Africa expert. He'd been all over Africa. We said, why don't you take the Bit Africa guide, turn it into a real book? We'll publish it and we'll pay you for it. And which is what we did, and probably upset a few people a bit, but Jeff was out the door anyway. And that started another long relationship, because then Jeff went on to work on a variety of other guides for us. So that was, then we had, by this time, I had how many? 5 guides. And, oh God, and they sort of came on one by one. When we were traveling across Asia, we met a journalist, Carol Clulow, who was on her way across Asia like we were, but we were heading down to Australia. She was heading up to Hong Kong. And she lived in Hong Kong for a couple of years, and completely by chance, we bumped into her again in Bali. We'd sort of said goodbye to her in Kathmandu. We traveled with her from Afghanistan to Kathmandu and farewelled her there as she went off to Hong Kong. And then we just found ourselves in adjacent hotel rooms in Bali 2 years later. And when the things were starting to go, we said to her, you've just lived in Hong Kong for 2 years. Why don't you just zip back there and write a Hong Kong guide for us? So that was the Hong Kong guide. And really in those early days, it was very much like that. Chance meetings led to guidebooks.
It's interesting to hear how that started. When you did your first trip from London to Afghanistan and then on to Australia, did you meet anybody that you still keep in touch with, or maybe has reached out to you in subsequent years and said, do you remember meeting me on this trip?
Well, certainly Carol Clulow. And, I probably, I haven't been in touch with her for probably 5-10 years. But probably if I put a little bit of effort in, I could probably find him. Ended up being a novelist and wrote a number of books, including a book that was turned into a television series, A Woman's Guide to Adultery. Great title. It was not a bad little TV series. And she wrote a number of other books, and she was associated, I forget which rock band it was, a reasonably successful British rock band. And she was with them and wrote a book about, hanging out with the rock band. So she wrote a number of books. And I don't think she's written anything recently, but I'm sure some of them are still in print. And if I went to her publisher, I'm sure I could find Carol. One or two other people. There was another journalist we met who was in Belfast, and we've sort of, I haven't been in touch with him for many years, but I think if I wanted to, I could find him. But the remarkable thing is how many other people were sort of kicking around in that region at that time. And you bump into them occasionally, and so there's an Australian couple who I'm in very regular contact with. It's rarely a few weeks past we don't exchange an email, or if we're in Australia, have a meal together and things. And they were in. We never saw them in Afghanistan, but they were in Afghanistan around that same time, and they started a sort of carpet importing business, importing Afghan carpets. Now, they became real experts on carpets. They really knew their Afghan carpets. And when they made the movie in Australia, Evil Angels, was it called Evil Angels? About the dingo dog death, the baby that was killed by a dingo, and the woman was unfairly accused of the crime, and they made a movie about it. Meryl Streep made the movie in Australia, and Meryl Streep went to Alexandra and Lee to buy Afghan carpets because they knew more about Afghan carpets than anybody else. And they still, Alexandra more than Lee is a real ceramic artist. And I visited them in China, where they go each year to work on ceramics in Jingdezhen, which is the ceramic capital of China. So they do their ceramic work and sell their ceramics based out of China. And they visit China each year for a few months. But also remarkably, they get carpets made they got this village basically working for them in Afghanistan, turning out Afghan carpets to modern designs, and to Alexandra's own designs. They're not the traditional Afghan carpets, which I've bought a number of from Alexandra and Lee. She sends the designs in. This village weaves away, makes the carpets, collects them up, sends them off to Pakistan, ships them out from Pakistan. And I'm talking from, I've got a place in London. I'm in my London place right now, and I know over there on the floor behind me is one of Alexandra's carpets from Afghanistan, from that time in Afghanistan in the 70s, yeah. So they were in and out of Afghanistan, and it's remarkable how many other people were. There's a long list of people who were in Afghanistan at the time and still maintain links with the place.
You have been writing travel books for your entire professional career. Do you also read travel literature outside of your own work?
Absolutely, yeah. There's always there's so much to read, and you're going to ask me now what's the most recent one I read, and I'm going to have trouble remembering it unless I look at the folder on my laptop of where the books are. But yeah, I read travel books all the time. I read a lot of other books as well, but travel is certainly a good part.
Is that something you like to do while traveling? Do you usually carry a book with you?
Oh yeah, I always, these days, of course, I carry it on my iPad rather than in paper. But yeah, there's always a book, and I should really almost, I could open my iPad, look down at what I've read recently, and see if there's anything travel there that rings a travel bell, and I'm sure there'll be something that started there. I can't find it instantly. But yeah, I mean, I do read a lot of travel books, and I read old ones as well as new ones, and people will say to you really should look at that book that is worth studying for more information?
Going back to around the time of your first trip along the hippie trail across Asia, before you went and while you were on that journey, what was fellow travelers or students before that, their sense of what was going on in Vietnam at that time? What were people's attitudes towards that? And what
Well,
was yours? What do you remember thinking about all of that?
I remember Vietnam, when we were in Southeast Asia in 74, if you asked Americans at that time, let's have a holiday in Southeast Asia, and say, what is it? It's a war zone. Um, Thailand wasn't the place everyone went to. Bali hadn't really taken off yet. It was not what it became in the subsequent years. We were sort of, in a way, pioneers there. But at the same time, the Vietnam War was winding down, and we were there as that was happening. And the thing that I remember, Vietnam, there was a sort of war going. You couldn't get into Vietnam. Um, we did actually think about trying to get into Cambodia, and year zero was about to happen, and it was all about to go disastrously wrong. If we got into Cambodia, we probably not got out of Cambodia, but you could go to Laos. And we actually went to Laos in 1974, just as it was about to implode. But it was a quieter implosion. A lot of people did die, but it wasn't like the war in Vietnam or like the Khmer Rouge and Year Zero and so on in Cambodia. And we spent a couple of weeks traveling around Laos and some interesting times. And then, of course, all of Southeast Asia basically shut down. The last step was the American evacuation from. I do like recently Mr. Trump, Taco Trump, saying, that when America steps into things, it's win, win, win. And I was thinking, wait a minute, I see it as lose, lose, lose. Lost in Vietnam, lost in Afghanistan, lost in Iraq. Where are these wins? But the things were winding down in Vietnam, and then the doors shut. From that sort of end mid-70s, we put Laos in our first Southeast Asia on a shoestring guide, but it was pointless because nobody could go to Laos, and nobody did go there effectively for 10, 15 years. Really, really beginning of the 90s that things reopened. But all that region was closed off for 10, 15 years.
Mhm. How do you think writing about a place can change it over time?
One of the things that amuses me is we get accused of being, one of the root causes of over tourism. And if you hadn't done this guidebook to somewhere, it's ridiculous. We're one factor amongst many, many others that have changed places. And, even if there hadn't been tourists there at all, they would have changed dramatically because of the way that work had changed and employment had changed and communication had changed, and tourism was another factor in it. At the same time, one of the places which I'm accused of wrecking is Bali, and I was back in Bali earlier this year, and it's just it is over touristed. There's too many tourists, and it's badly managed. If they'd put some of the huge amount of money that the government had sucked out of Bali back into building a train system across the south of the island, instead of putting everybody leaving the airport into taxis and causing horrific traffic jams that just go on and on and on, it'd be a better place. So, Bali, I wouldn't say Bali's been wrecked because I had a wonderful time there again. But, it's not what it once, it's not the same as it once was. And I've been accused of doing that. And I didn't do that. I was, we put out a Southeast Asia guide and then a Bali guide, but that wasn't what has transformed Bali. I like to say that, if doing a Lonely Planet guidebook is what changes a place. Well, I wish I could look at Afghanistan and say we changed that, because we did do back in the early part of this century, when Afghanistan was sort of starting to open, we thought might start to open up again. And I went back and traveled all around Afghanistan. I think it was 2006. I had a great time. And we thought, well, maybe Afghanistan will reopen and there'll be tourists going there. And it's an amazing country, truly amazing country. And we did an Afghanistan guide. We sent a researcher in there. Who I might be seeing him this evening. And he traveled all around Afghanistan and wrote a very good book to it. And, we sold a fair number of copies to the assorted military in Afghanistan. We didn't sell many copies to travelers returning there. And I would love to say, look, I wrecked Bali by sending all the tourists there. And then I wrecked Afghanistan. Afghanistan, forget the Soviets, forget the Mujahideen, forget the Americans and other Western powers that went in. But oh God, when that Lonely Planet guide came out, that's when things went really wrong.
From your experience of taking long journeys, could you share some insights about the benefits of long-term travel?
Oh, look, I think the benefits of any travel, and I think, particularly when you're young, um, big trips, have an impact on you that you never get over. And, I was fortunate to have a couple of big trips in that era. And both of them, I'll say were sort of the best trips of my, yeah, I saw every trip I do is wonderful. I've been in Greece in the past week, and for some reason, I'd never been to the island of Hydra, which is where Leonard Cohen sort of made his first steps and artistic steps. And it's always been a sort of artistic center and probably is in some ways. And I'd never been there, and it's probably suffering from over tourism. A lot of people who've been to Hydra 20, 30 years ago and saved, certainly Leonard Cohen would say if he was still alive. And yet it was delightful. I had a really interesting time there. I really enjoyed it. But I think any long trip does have an impact on you. And I think there's a lot to be said for sort of traveling closer to ground level. And, young people who are on their gap years, whatever they want to call them, and traveling off somewhere and experiencing things that, I've got a quote by a Spanish author about her travels when she was young and the impact they had on her. And basically she just says, that the closer you travel to ground level, the more contact you have, the more people you need. You empty your wallet out and you'll have better experiences.
To ask you if you could share if you've had any interactions with people over the years who have used your guidebooks and found them useful or had good experiences with them.
Oh, look, yeah, lots. And I'm proud of what we did. And I still get a real kick out of it. And I love travel myself still, and I still use guidebooks when I travel. But I look back at the people who've interacted with them in some ways, and I'll put them into assorted categories. One is the people who work with us, putting the guidebooks together, and all of them, they seem to have they were good travelers. They were interested in the places they were going to. They were immersed in it because they studied the history, learned the language, traveled extensively. They were good travelers in that way, and they loved doing what they were doing. Now, I don't think I've met a real travel writer who didn't love being a travel writer, like doing that more than anything else. And then a lot of the people who worked for us at Lonely Planet, loved the job and loved working on the books and loved putting the books together. It was a great occupation, a great thing to do. And then the places that we wrote about, a lot of them, I've often met people who've run hotels that we've been nice about, and we helped their business, we helped their operation work, and they were happy about that. And good people, lots of good people I've met over the years. Then the other factor, of course, is the people who use the books, and and so many of them are very, very nice to me when I bump into them. Yeah, I regularly get somebody saying, "Oh, I used your book to so and so 30 years ago, and it was a great trip, and it was my first big trip, and it had an effect on me that I've never got over, and um, can't argue with that."
I remember first using the internet when I was maybe at the end of elementary school, but I don't think it really had an impact on my life until towards the end of high school or even after high school. When did you
And
start to notice
what
the
year would
internet
that be?
changing the guidebook business?
When would you say that you first noticed the internet really having an effect on your?
Well, I did long-term travel in 2004, and
Yeah.
I used email once in a while, maybe once a week or something.
Yeah,
So most of my day-to-day life had no internet in it at that
yeah,
time. So sometime after that, I think I got my first laptop 2006 or 7 or something, and then started using the internet more regularly.
yeah. Well, I would say that was 10 years down the line. My sort of first memories of it, and you didn't. Uh, I wasn't like an early adopter. I remember people who were early adopters of email and saying to me, "Oh, you should really use email." And I say, "Oh, why would I want to do that? If I want to speak to someone, I can phone them or write them a postcard or something." I didn't instantly jump on the email thing, but nevertheless, we sort of, in a way, were there in, you said 2004 or 2006. We were there 10 years earlier, in 1994. I remember it clearly because um, the San Francisco-based company who were the sort of, I should have had pulled these names out before I sat down. So I'm so bad these days at bringing up names instantly. O'Reilly, who were a publisher who really were pioneers on the internet and the software that made the internet work. And in 1994, they did an early website called GNN, Global Network Navigator, and it really was a pioneering website. And they said to two people, um, well, Maureen and I were one person. We were going to do a trip across the states, and they said, "Why don't you send us a daily blog?" I mean, the word blog hadn't been invented for many years, but we effectively did a blog as we traveled across the US, west east and then east west, of what our travels were. And another writer that was at that time traveling around the world, and he wrote at surface level. So he didn't take any flights. He was on boats, he was on trains, he was on buses, whatever. And he wrote a book called Size of the World. And again, that was blogged via Global Network Navigator. So that was an early use of it. And then Lonely Planets, very soon after that, started its own website. So around 1994. And away it went. And the thing I remember from the start, people used to write to us at Lonely Planet, give us travel information. And that was all on paper, sent on postcards and so on. And now I keep looking over my shoulder because Maureen's, she is, and I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to go to another room because she's going to be having breakfast and I'm going to be disturbing her. So just a momentary pause. Lonely Planets then all the stuff that used to come in on print and postcards and letters now started coming in on emails. And the sort of information center at that Lonely Planet at that time was a thing called the Thorn Tree. And it was named after the African custom of putting messages pinned onto a thorn tree. And in Nairobi, in Kenya, there was a hotel with a very popular cafe, and there was a notice board in the cafe called the Thorn Tree. And the Lonely Planet Thorn Tree took its name from that real thorn tree, or effectively real thorn tree. And it worked remarkably well for many years. And there were a lot of people. I mean, I left Lonely Planet 14 years ago, so I'm long out of Lonely Planet. But when the thorn tree was shut down a couple of years ago, a lot of people were very sad about that. It was certainly, you know, comments were made about it in lots of places. And I used to, if I was going anywhere wild and wonderful, I would always check the thorn tree and see what people had said about going there. And the place I remember most clearly recently was, and this is 5, 10 years ago now, traveling around the Congo. And the Congo has always seemed to me it's deepest, darkest Africa in many ways. I was amazed when Taco Trump drew up his latest list of places not to go to. He put in Congo Brazzaville, but he didn't put in Congo DRC. And Congo Brazzaville is sort of the safe Congo, and Congo DRC is the big bad Congo. And it's always intrigued me because we've had an Africa guide. We were talking about the Bit Guide earlier on, for a long time, and the Congo is sort of the testing point on that, because it started at just 10 pages, and then it grew and grew and grew because a lot of people were traveling there, with subsequent editions of the Africa Guide. And then people said, war broke out and it was a horror story, and the numbers started to go down. People left, and then the book contracted. There were less pages on Congo. So when I went and traveled around Congo a bit, I took an old Lonely Planet Africa guide because it had more information, and I also checked the thorn tree, and it was remarkable, the people who went there. It's a bit like all these people who went to Afghanistan. A lot of people traveled around the Congo and had amazing adventures. If you so many books, Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, Bend in the River, B.S. Nepal, the Conrads, and Congo has been heavily written about.
Over the years of travel, has your expectations or goals with travel changed or evolved at all?
Yeah, yes and no. I still enjoy travel, and there was actually just before I got online with you, there was an article in the newspaper by a journalist who I've travelled with several times, Simon Calder, British journalist in London, based out of London, and he said something about going everywhere, and he said he'd never been and didn't. I don't plan to go everywhere. I'm not there. There are list tickers, who they want to go to every country on earth, and I'm unhappy if a year passes I don't go to one or two new places, but I'm not going to live long enough to go to every country on earth. And I mean, if anybody who wants to say I've been to every country on earth, and if they've got enough money, can set a year aside and start jumping on planes and flying places, and they can do it. But is that travel? I don't know. I don't think that really is at all. So yeah, my goals are still there. There are places that interest me that I'd still like to see that I haven't seen, but I'm not going to see them all by any means.
And the last question I want to ask you today is to talk a little about what you've got going on in 2025, if it's all right. Do you have plans for more travel in the second half of this year?
Yeah, where have I been this year already? I had an interesting trip to Bali because it was a bunch of travel writers and, excuse me, travel publishers looking at how Bali in Indonesia has changed so much over the years. I read my first guidebook that covered Indonesia reasonably comprehensive. What am I claiming? 1974. Bill Dalton, his Indonesia handbook, he was there. It was the same era. And a German photographer, writer, Hans Hofer, who did a guide to Bali in the late 60s. So we were looking back over a long period of time and talking about how this particular tourist destination had changed. So I was there. And then subsequently, I've been in traveling, did some travel in Australia, a couple of interesting Australian places where I lived for half the year. And then came to London, and I've just been in Greece for 10 days. In Greece, so many islands. At the end of it, I mentioned Leonard Cohen and Hydra. I went to Hydra for a few days with one of our group. The group was originally 9, and 7 came back to London. 2 of us carried on, and Nick, who I was traveling with, said, well, this was great. We should set aside a month next year and do a bunch of Greek islands, which you could do very easily. There are so many of them, and so many that I've not been, and quite a few of them are not over, obviously Mykonos and Santorini are overrun by tourists, but a lot of the others are not overrun by tourists and would be interesting to spend some time in. I've got 2 other trips planned this year. One is to Jamaica, because I've never been to Jamaica, and Bob Marley's hometown and all that stuff. So Jamaica, I've been to most of the other places in the Caribbean, and lived in the Bahamas for a couple of years, and I've been to Cuba a number of times. I've been to Haiti. What a sad place that is, more than once. Wonderful, wonderful country, and badly managed. So Jamaica is on my list. But then I'm also going back to Nepal, and I haven't been to Nepal for maybe about 10 years. And I've been there a lot of times. There's a place in the world to go walking. It's Nepal, and I've done a lot of walking in Nepal. I've walked up to the Everest Base Camp, and I've walked the Annapurna Circuit, and I've walked up to the Tibetan border. And I'm doing a trip which is kind of a sad in a way, because it's a trip I've walked before, but now there's a road. So unfortunately, we'll be traveling by road. And I'm not the guide on this group thing, but they get me to talk, and there's a photographer friend who will photograph, and the people who are paying to come on this trip, some of the money that they pay goes to the Australian Himalayan Foundation, so it will come back to good things in Nepal.
Right. Well, I've really enjoyed the opportunity to learn more about your life and career, and especially for your time today. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
I hope it all works well.